several months ago. The girl I was seeing suggested that for our third date, we take a bottle of wine, a laptop, and a scary movie to the most remote graveyard we could possibly find. We were both hardcore horror fans, and we felt shattered and immune to fear. So putting ourselves into the ideal situation for terror sounded like an exciting adventure. We selected a graveyard from public records that neither of us have visited, and she drove us an hour out into the deep back country. When we finally found its location, we ended up having to park 3 miles away behind some large undergrowth. There had been no other place to turn off. Along the forested country road, we walked down a dirt path towards the unmarked graveyard, trying not to tread into the undergrowth on either side. The trees eventually opened up into a small dark clearing, and the century-old gravestones sat scattered about in no discernible organization. We set up our laptop on a blanket, opened our wine, turned off our flashlights, and started the movie. The atmosphere was powerfully creepy, but I still felt relatively safe and excited until the unexpected happened. Less than 10 minutes into the movie, we saw a pickup truck go by on the country road outside the graveyard. We could see its lights through the trees as it passed. The only vehicle we had seen that night. We shrugged, thinking nothing of it until it came back the other way. Its headlights were distinctive, and we were sure it was the same truck. When it slowly turned into the gated entrance to the graveyard, I closed up the laptop and we froze as its headlights fell on us for a moment. The truck backed up, apparently turning around, and then proceeded to park right outside the entrance. We couldn't be sure if they had seen us, and we certainly had no idea what they intended on doing. I suggested we pack up, and my date agreed. We gathered up all of our things and we were about to stand up when the truck went dark. We crouched there in a pitch black for a few moments, confused and afraid. We had no idea who it was in the truck and why he wasn't exiting. The path we had entered by it was far too close to the truck to risk using it, and we didn't want to blindly make our way through the woods, making noise with every step, and potentially get lost. After another few minutes, I started to suspect that maybe the driver had fallen asleep, or perhaps there were 2 people inside making outs, and would be completely oblivious to us passing by. I grabbed my date's hand in mine, and without speaking, motioned her forward with me towards the path. There was nothing else to do but attempt to creep past the truck slowly, one silent and carefully placed step at a time. As we started down the path, I looked over and tried to discern anything from inside the truck, and strained my ears for any kind of sound, but was unable to make anything out. Once we made it out of the truck's line of sight, we picked up our pace slightly, but the lack of any incident had only increased our fear. I tried to reassure myself that we were in a clear, and the whole thing was just a creepy random coincidence, but my heart's only pounded harder as I lead my day down the path towards our car. It was hard to feel safe and darkness over, where if a silent figure was stalking us, and the notion of the truck's occupant haunting us was impossible for me to dismiss. We were about half a mile away from our car when we heard a woman scream from behind us, somewhere in the woods, followed by a gunshot. We froze for a moment, until the echo of the gunshot faded, and then started to run as fast as we could to the car. While you're on a road at this point, and I calculated we could reach the car in a matter of minutes. But then I froze in my tracks again and awkwardly brought my date to a dead stop. I told her that we needed to hide, because if the truck was coming our way it would overtake us before we reached the car. And even if by some miracle we reached the car first, there was always the possibility that truck would spot us parked or pulling out, and then we'd be seriously screwed. I had to repeat myself twice before she understood what I was saying in our panic state, and we dove into the undergrowth and hid ourselves under the blanket, laying as flat upon the ground as we could. My cheek was suppressed into cold wet mud, and I could hear my date trying to control her frantic breathing. I let go of her hand and stroked her hair gently in an attempt to calm her down. After maybe a minute, my prediction came true. We heard a truck coming, and then Slide's distinctive headlights go through the darkness and drive past us. Suddenly it hit the brakes hard and I heard it back up and stop it idle there on the road, unmoving for what felt like 10 minutes, and to my horror, I realized it must have spotted something on the side of the road. I must have dropped something. After the longest few minutes of my life, the truck slowly rolled forward down the road, the driver deciding not to leave the cab. After I was sure the truck was gone, I whispered to my date that we should probably wait for a short while. If the driver had spotted our car amongst the undergrowth, he may have decided to wait close by for us to return. Seeing as how this guy has got a gun, it was a risk we decided not to take. We got up from our hiding spot and disappeared deeper into the woods and found a derriter patch of dirt to hide on. And it was then I noticed that one of the flashlights was missing. It was possible we had dropped it on the side of the road and the trucks hit lights that reflected off of it. We decided to lay under the blanket again, which was brown. And after I sprinkled the fuel leaves on top, we decided we were well hidden enough for the time being. We laid there for what felt like an hour, and we were starting to feel silly about the whole thing, when suddenly we heard a car coming up back of the road. From the sound of the engine, we could tell it was the same truck. Only the headlights weren't on, and it was clearly moving at a crawl. We both froze and held our breath. The truck continued to drift by like a hungry shark gliding through the water, and we were immediately relieved that we had decided to be so cautious. We had prepared ourselves for the long haul and decided not to move until at least dawn. We took turns dozing, and by the time the sun began to rise in the distance, we were both very sweaty and sore and eager to stretch out. I began to whisper that I was going to get up and have a peek when in the distance we heard a cell phone ring. It was crisp and clear like a church bell, and it couldn't have been more than 50 or so yards away. The cell phone was silenced after 2 rings, and we strained our ears for any additional sound. After a few moments, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps shambling away, but I wasn't sure enough to risk my life on it. Will you lay still for another few hours? And before long, we began to hear the sound of cars driving past us pretty regularly. I figured it had to be after 8 a.m., and I made myself wait until 3 more cars are driven by before I set up. We gathered our belongings, and the sunshine bright and warm and comforting, we made our way to the car. I made my day height and wait as I approached the car, in case someone was waiting for us. I got in and started the car, and threw open the passenger side door for her. She ran over and jumped in, and we forwarded back to town and directly to the police station. We walked in covered in mud and dirt and told them our story. They dispatched someone to the graveyard, but we're unable to locate a body or any traces of blood. I have no idea what happened that night, what was going on with that guy inside the truck, and if that cell phone had anything to do with it. But I feel grateful to be alive. Since then, all the horror movies we've watched together have been in the safety of our homes. When you live in rural Kansas, there's never really much to do that doesn't involve tractors, picket fences, and a whole lot of wide open space. There are no malls nearby, and the closest movie theater is 40 miles away. So it's no surprise that kids start drinking as early as grade 6 and have sex with each other just to kill time. That was never my style, though. I figured out another way to kill time. About a half hour from my town is a hidden cemetery at the end of a long winding gravel road, and the majority of the people buried there are children under the age of 10. Mostly from the 1800s, some of the stones are nothing more than crumbling ruins, and even the newer ones were weather-stained and mossy. During the day, it's pretty peaceful, even beautiful, but at night, it's a playground for the children who reside beneath it. I know this firsthand. Last summer, my friends and I decided to head out to the cemetery in the middle of the night. I had been there plenty of times during the day, but I've never been there after sunset. And we figured it would be a creepy experience to wander through the maze of headstones with flashlights and see who would make it back to the car first. When we reached the rusty gates after carefully navigating the winding dirt road, I parked the car and we all climbed out. The first thing I noticed was how alarmingly quiet it was. During the day, there had always been a pleasant melody of birds, chirping insect noises and the rustling of the wind through the overhead leaves. Standing in the pitch darkness, it almost felt like we were in the vacuum of space, or deep beneath the earth. I felt completely isolated and alone and kept glancing up at the night sky, desperate to find a star. I kept the car running and the headlights on it, and we wandered across the cemetery aimlessly, not looking for anything in particular, just reading the headstones and trying to enjoy the thrill of the experience of being there so late at night. None of us were drunk or inhibited in any way, unless you count how wired we were from Monster energy drinks. I was off in the far corner of the graveyard by myself, trying to find the earliest date inscribed in stone, when my friend Nick called over asking who was already back at the car. I turned around and looked back at the idling car, but I didn't see anyone standing by it. We did a head count and all of us were scattered around the stones, nowhere near the headlights. Nick claimed that he had definitely seen a shadow back over by the passenger seat, but when no one owned up, we kind of shrugged it off and went back to exploring our respective areas. I started picking up twigs and fallen branches and clearing them away from the graves, when I thought I heard a child's laughter from somewhere beyond the fence, out in the trees. It didn't say anything out loud, but I showed my flashlight into the woods, half expecting to see a random kid picking out from behind a tree. I knew I wasn't hearing things because the forest around me was dead quiet, and all of my friends were back in the other direction. But the idea that someone, child or not, was out there in the trees without any kind of light didn't sit right with me, and I began to make my way back to the car. Nick was still hanging around the stones, and Lewis was sitting by the fence facing out into the woods. But my friend Joel had returned to the car and was sitting in the passenger seat. I was about to make my way towards Nick, when we all heard a jingle of music, and our flashlight beams turned and aimed themselves as one towards a gravestone that we had all overlooked. Sitting on the ground was a small red box with a crank on the side, and it was slowly turning on its own. "It's a jack in the box," I said out loud. Nick pointed his flashlight at the stone, as the music continued to play. Why would someone leave a toy on a grave for a kid that died in 1904? I was about to respond, when suddenly the crank spun insanely fast and the music blurred, and the jack popped from its box. The three of us jumped back in shock and apprehension. The crank had gone from barely moving to spinning like a helicopter propeller. We gave each other sideways looks, and as one began to walk back to the car, we all piled in, and I looked over at Joel, who seemed agitated and spooked. "What's wrong with one of you smacking the outside of the car just now?" We all shook our heads, and Joe explained that when he had returned to the car and shut the door, he heard the soft tapping of hands against the exterior of the car, starting at the trunk and slowly making their way forward towards the passenger seat. We all thought he was just being nervous and paranoid. A half hour later, we parked the car in my garage and piled out. I immediately froze. I noticed with alarming clarity that there were dozens of child-sized handprints, peppered all over the passenger side. Nick and the others all saw them, but we rarely ever speak about it. I've been back to the cemetery since in daylight, but I was never able to find that jack in the box again. This story is told from the point of view of a female. The summer before I got married, I returned to my hometown to spend some time with some of my old friends from high school. I stayed with my friend Rachel, who was still unmarried and had been my best friend all throughout grade school, until just after high school graduation. We spent some time sitting in her basement and reminiscing about the old days, when Rachel pulled out one of her old yearbooks and flipped to a page where we had both written down our bucket list of things to do before we were both married. Most of them were vacation ideas and sexual endeavors that we had already achieved, but one that stuck out to us that we had yet to accomplish was to visit the Green Lady Cemetery at night all alone. We had gone through a supernatural phase as teenagers and had enjoyed exploring creepy old houses, taking photos and recording EVPs. We decided to be spontaneous and daring, and drove to the Green Lady Cemetery. Right then and there, close to 1 o'clock in the morning. The Green Lady Cemetery wasn't its actual name, but at school that's what we referred to it as, since there were stories of a woman in a green dress who would wander across the property at night. We drove straight to the graveyard, stone cold sober, and parked at the gate. We climbed over the fence and wandered amongst the stones, suddenly feeling ridiculous as we hadn't brought any cameras or recording devices of any kind. It quickly dawned on me that the thrill of being able to say we wandered through a supposedly haunted cemetery at night carried much more weight when we were 18. At the moment, as adults, it didn't seem rewarding, but it was still kind of fun and a nostalgic kind of way just to be getting into trouble with Rachel again. We made small talk and wandered through the rows of headstones, putting our flashlights around, and not feeling particularly scared, as not far away we could still faintly hear the sounds of traffic. We stopped to sit down on the grass and talked for a while when Rachel pointed past me into the darkness, amongst the stones a few yards away. "What's that?" she asked, more excited than alarmed. I noticed a very small pinprick of orange light and shrugged, a slight feeling of disappointment starting to sink in. "I think it's a cigarette. I guess we're not alone after all." "Oh, fuck." Rachel grumbled and waved her hand in an exaggerated greeting, in the direction of the small light. There was a few seconds of silence before a deep, raspy voice called out to us, clear as glass, "Fucking leave. We're going to tear your baby out." My blood went extremely cold, and we leapt to our feet in shock and fear. Rachel screamed back in the direction of the voice, "What the fuck did you just say? Don't fucking threaten us? Come closer. I'll kick your pansy ass." I quickly grabbed Rachel by the arm and dragged her back in the direction of the car. Rachel was still screaming profanities back at whoever had spoken. I didn't turn back around, so I don't know what the stranger was doing, but he never uttered another word. Rachel was pissed the whole ride home that we were actually bullied into leaving like that. But I calmed her down after we hit a drive-through and went back to her place and chowed down. We had a good laugh over it and dissented to cross the experience off our bucket list anyway. Rachel eventually passed out on her couch while we watched a movie, but I remained wide awake, a cold sweat running down my neck until dawn came. In retrospect, I feel I did a great job of hiding my genuine terror from Rachel, as I hadn't told her that I was pregnant and was way too early to be showing. What the stranger said in the cemetery might have just been by coincidence, but regardless, it had shaken me to my bones. I eventually fell asleep at 7 in the morning, the echo of the man's throat repeating itself on an endless loop inside my head of United Slater. I started my long drive back home across state to my fiancée and family, but stopped before I got to the highway. I couldn't resist swinging by the Green Lady Cemetery one last time. I parked the car but didn't get out. As night was beginning to fall, I just stared out across the graves and into the distance for several minutes. It was only when darkness had completely fallen that I noticed a speck of glowing orange light from within the fence, among the headstones. I turned on my car headlights, but there was no one standing there to be illuminated by them. I immediately reversed out of the parking lot and got back on the road and never looked back.